All right, well, that's the end of chapter 10 there. And so now we'll move on to chapter 11, which asks the questions, well, how do we explain things? And so he starts off with chapter 11 here by saying the ability to explain things and to seek explanations is at the heart of the intellectually virtuous life, right? We view the person who is able to explain things in a positive light. There are times when that could be overly done, or we could be listening to things that we don't want to hear. But overall, we find the people in our lives who can help us and explain things to our level or have a grasp of the material. And we say that person kind of exhibits a good life, a virtuous life there. But few of us stop to consider that there are different types of explanations for various phenomena we encounter. For example, the philosophers of religion, Richard Swinburne, has made the rather obvious, though often overlooked point, that there is a great difference between a standard physical scientific explanation for some events and a personal explanation. In this short chapter, he wants to introduce our bearings regarding these two types of explanations, a scientific one and a personal one.
Right. So what's the difference here and how do they work, right? Well, let's start with standard scientific explanations because that's where he starts with. He says in standard scientific explanations, a state, also called an event or a change of state, is explained. So that's what scientific explanations attempt to do. Explain an event or a state or a change of a state or an event. For example, he says we may try to explain why the pressure of a gas is in a certain state or why it changed into that state, right? And so he says we also may try to determine the reason, for instance, a tornado was formed. And he tells us that in such cases, one event causes another event in accordance with some law of nature. So there it is. There we see actually a couple of things, right? Event, and laws of nature. And so what he says is we have event causation. So now that's the basic idea of a standard scientific explanation. Now he's going to kind of expand on that to help us to understand it.
Right. So associated with event causation is a covering law model of explanation according to which some event is explained or covered by giving a valid deductive or inductive argument for that event. Such an argument utilizes two features. First, a universal or statistical law of nature, or two, some initial causal conditions. So, for example, all metal rods expand if heated is the law. Metal rod X was heated, there's the condition, and therefore metal rod X expanded. So the explanation. So, boiling water, you can do this. And then you talk about, well, the particles move at a different rate and they become less solidified to each other. And so you talk about the different states of matter there. When it comes to the law of molecules and how they exhibit different behaviors, whether cooled or heated. And so that's what the example is doing as well. So you have your law, then your condition, the thing that was done, and then the explanation is what you expect. And so it should tie to that law. So the conditions should tie to the law to give you the explanation. So that's how the associated causation there happens.
Now he does mention that obviously not all scientists hold to this particular position, but This is the basic one that many hold to. It's called the covering law model. So that is standard scientific explanation. You have a law, you have conditions, initial conditions, and then you have the explanation as a result. What about personal explanations? What are they and how are they different if they are different? Well, it says standard scientific explanations are crucial, but they must stay in their lane, he tells us. They're not the only way to explain why things happen. A personal explanation of some event or state of affairs intentionally brought about by a person, divine or otherwise, will employ notions such as not laws, but intention of the agent, right? The relevant power of the agent that was exercised in causing the state of affairs. So it's not necessarily the conditions or the laws, right? But it's the intention and the power of the particular agent.
Right. So these kinds of explanations are used all the time, especially in court. In a murder trial, for example, the jury seeks personal explanations. Who committed the murder? What power did he use to do this? Did the alleged killer actually possess that power? And could he exercise it all at the right place at the right time? And what were his intentions? All, but really the last, that's the motive. You don't really need a motive for court. But all those things are things that are necessary to explain for convicting someone of murder. that they committed murder, that they did a thing. And so you don't talk about, well, objects that travel at certain meters per second interacted with a body that was not at motion, and that body fell over. And we say that they expired. So, okay, well, we found that the bullet killed the person. Good, done. We found the explanation. Moving on. Guilty. The bullet is guilty. No, we're trying to get to the intelligence behind the use of that bullet. So a personal explanation does not consist in offering an impersonal, unintentional mechanism, but rather incorrectly citing the relevant person, his or her intentions, and the basic power exercise. Well, that person doesn't have any hands. They couldn't have fired the bullet. And so we know that somebody else did, or that person at least didn't use their hands to fire the gun. A covering law model of explanation, in contrast, would be out of court, pun intended, in a jury trial. No jury wants to know the natural law and relevant formula needed to calculate why bullets are able to be discharged from a gun. Now, sometimes that is possible, but or that is done in court, but that's only done to solidify that personal explanation of where someone was standing, or could they have been from here, or was there a second shooter involved? All those things could be utilized. The covering model could be utilized, but for the state purposes of having an explanation from the personal aspect, that's not the only answer that we care about. It's not bullets go out of guns for this reason. You'll use that in your explanation, but then you'll talk about it in a greater capacity to talk about the who and the why.
Yeah. Good. All right. So what has he done so far? Well, he's asked the question, how do we explain? He says there are at least two basic ways to explain. The scientific kind of explanation that has to do with covering law model, right? And personal explanations that has to do with persons, intention, and that sort of thing. So that's, there's two kinds of ways to explain. And he's going to pursue this further in the next chapter. But now at the end of this chapter, he wants to make one more point. He talks about the criteria for things that are scientifically inexplicable, right? Scientifically inexplicable. What are the criteria that we need to show that something cannot be explained by science? And so he says in the next chapter, he wants to look at 5 things that science cannot explain, even in principle. But before we get there, he tells us, to have criteria in place for knowing why it would be the case that science could not explain something. And of course, Richard Swinburne here identifies 2 features that do not fit into any pattern of scientific explanation. Phenomena that are, first, too odd, and phenomena that are too big. So he wants to look at these 2 things in turn.
Right. So phenomena that are too odd to fit into a pattern of scientific explanation is the first one that he covers. What would it mean for a phenomenon to be too odd to be explained by science? One, when you have to add new laws just to make sense of the event. People who have been dead for 2 to 3 days coming back to life due to prayer. Well, that's quite odd, and we'd have to come up with some explanation for that.
Yeah,
so
notice all the gyrations a scientist would have to go through in order to make that event into a scientific kind of explanation, right? He'd have to, invent all kinds of things in order to help try to explain that, right?
Right. Exactly.
That's so odd.
Swinburne's point is that any attempt to revise the medical theory so that its laws can now predict apparent miracles would make the theory hopelessly complex and arbitrary. So, barring the explanation of, well, it only appeared that way, but have it be the case that this is all the added extra things that would come into play here would kind of overturn our understandings.
Yeah, good. All right. So the first one, too odd to fit a pattern of scientific explanation, is when you have to add new laws just to make sense of the event. The second one is when the new phenomenon leaves us with a large number of unwieldy brute facts that cannot be explained and that make our laws or theories violate the principle of simplicity. So we have all kinds of brute facts that don't fit into what's going on. They're dangling out there that aren't part of the coherent explanation. He says that violates the law of simplicity, the principle of simplicity, and it shows, again, that, things are too odd.
Yeah. Well, and that kind of fits into this third point, when you have a new phenomenon utterly unique from anything in the old theory. And the new phenomenon incorporated into the old theory is so utterly unique and different from every other entity in the theory, such that the new phenomenon's appearance cannot, in principle, have been predicted by the old theory. Then the expanded version of the old theory is false, right? This would be the revolution, not in little bits of phenomenal aspects that we view, but this would be, giant things entering into the picture and going, wow, this is way too much for our current model. We kind of know it's wrong, but we don't have anything else to supplant it with. Well, according to Scientism, though, the entire history of the universe was a history of strictly physical entities until the very first sentient being evolved. And prior to the appearance of these beings, there were no sensations, thoughts, desires, and so forth. Some people even go even further than that and say there was no truth outside of the first formation of that knowledge being. And the appearance of the conscious was utterly unpredictable from even exhaustive godlike knowledge of brute matter. Thus, the nature of consciousness is odd, and it does not fit or is not at home in the naturalistic physical worldview. So, of course, then what you have to do is you have to expand your idea of what physicality is and what science is, or you just deny it all and say, nope, all we're dealing with is natural.
Right.
Unfortunately, it seems like the latter is what's being practiced most of the time.
So the phenomenon here is utterly unique. Consciousness arose somehow, right? Doesn't fit in with everything else that is part of the explanation of what's going on. And so this makes the theory of what's going on, this particular phenomenon of consciousness is odd, right? And so maybe we can't explain it naturalistically, physically, right? That's what he's getting at. And then finally, the fourth one here, he says, when you have phenomena contingently related to physical facts, right? So usually we look at causal relations, right? Or that sort of thing. But what about contingent relations, right? In other words, this doesn't have to be part of the deal, right? He says a full, adequate scientific explanation should show why some phenomena must occur given another phenomenon. So this has to happen because of this, right? This is the cause fact necessitates that the effect fact takes place. So this causal fact causes this effect fact, right? They relate to one another. But for instance, brain states, mental states, correlations, he says, are contingent, and therefore they are odd brute facts without a scientific explanation. Why? Well, because the things they don't necessarily relate, and they don't have to relate. They're not dependent. There isn't this causal, effectal kind of relationship, right? And so in some, he says, according to Swinburne, a phenomena is scientifically inexplicable if it's, and he spelled out, these various 4 characteristics of this.
Right. And then phenomena that are too big to fit into a pattern of scientific explanation. Well, Swinburne's first characteristic of scientific inexplicability of some phenomenon is its oddness. His second characteristic is that the phenomenon's too big. Rather than explain the too big criteria here, our author says, let us delve into some examples of things that science cannot in principle explain. And I think that if we do this, then the too big factor will become obvious. So to that subject, we'll turn to the next chapter, which is what we'll do next time.